Life is full of I can't believe that moments, right? If you look around, I bet you every week you see something, and in the world that is so connected and we can see so many things, we see a lot more things than maybe people in the past did. And so we are able to see things that others didn't. And I saw something this week that I looked at it and thought, I can't believe that. Anybody a fan of The Price is Right? Anybody should watch that show? A few of you. I love to be sick only because I get to stay home and watch The Price is Right at 10 o'clock. That's the only reason I like to be homesick. Other than that, I hate it. But this past week, I saw this video that happened recently on The Price is Right. And you know when they spin the big wheel, sometimes somebody will win a few bucks. But just watch this, and again, you'll say it with me that I can't believe that, okay?
Thank you. Started hosting the show 10 years ago. And we have a new special bonus on the wheel today. If you spin $1 on the wheel, you get $10,000. Come on, 75 for $10,000. $10,000. Anybody gets $1 gets $10,000. Let's give it away again. $10,000. Is it too much to ask to give away $30,000 on the wheel in one show? 85. You're looking for the green 15. Come on, baby. Oh, my goodness. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? $30,000. Oh, my goodness. What's happening? What is happening? So each of you just won $10,000. Congratulations. And now you get a bonus spin. You get an extra spin of the wheel. You only get one spin. If you land on the 5 or 15, you get another $10,000. If you land on the $1, I'll give you $25,000. Would love to see a $1. Oh my goodness, look at this. Look at this, look at this. $25,000. Slow down. Slow down. Oh my goodness, I don't know. $25,000 for Charlotte. We've given away $80,000 just on this wheel spin.
I only thought his poor Zachariah only got 10. Everybody else was raking in the dough there. But you look at that, and you look at that, I can't believe that. That's crazy, right? And you look at that, and that fits in the category of I can't believe that. Well, there are things in life, though, that sometimes we look at, and maybe we look at the Bible sometimes, and we look at those things and think, well, do I really believe that? That seems as incredible as winning $85,000 at the wheel kind of thing. And there are things that the world around you looks at in the Bible, and maybe you yourself look at in the Bible and you think, do I really believe that? Can I really buy all into that? And so that's what we're going to start here today over the next few weeks. In our 8 o'clock Sunday school class, which I know is early for a lot of you, but would always invite you to come. We've been walking through the book of Genesis, and we'd love to have you. And over the summer, we walked through the early chapters of Genesis 1 through 11. And as we did so, it continued to strike me week by week by week that you'd go through a news, and there was a lot of chaotic things that happened in our world over the summer. And yet we would read a chapter, read a story that happened so many years ago, and you would begin to find the implications for how we should think and approach and deal with the difficult things even today in those ancient stories. Things like, how did we get here? Or what are we supposed to be doing? Or how do we live? Or what's wrong with the world? Or is there anything wrong with the world? Or what's our place in the universe? And those kinds of things just continued to pop up in my mind as we walked through those chapters in the book of Genesis. I don't know if you knew it or not, but they built a life-size replica of Noah's Ark in northern Kentucky, and we happened to be there this summer and got to go see that, and so that kind of poured into my thinking and my mind, and I was just mesmerized and really thought a lot about those early chapters. And yet, you look at the world around us as we deal with racial tensions and sexuality issues and sanctity of life issues and abortion and care for the disabled and the vulnerable among us, and all of those issues continue to arise, and I kept seeing the Bible speaking into those issues through our text. And so today we're going to introduce this, and over the next few weeks we're going to walk our way through some of these stories in Genesis 1 through 11, and just allowing it hopefully to speak to us in a way that not just is it's old ancient stories that are nice to know, but they are ancient stories that have a powerful impact upon those that embrace them, and it changes the way we think and we view the world. And so we're going to unpack that and introduce that here today. And I'm going to make this easy for you today. If you want to memorize our text, some of you probably already have. We're going to look at one simple verse today. It's Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Because it introduces everything that comes after it. And one of the things that I love about the Bible is that it is an ancient book written over 1,500 years worth of time, and yet the themes that are introduced at the very beginning run consistently all the way through it. It's as if one person wrote the whole thing or gave it to us, and that's one of the things I love about the Bible, with so many different authors from so many different places, but the theme is the same. And it all begins with this, that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And you look at that passage, and most of you, even if you've never read much of the Bible, at least you had a good intention to say, you know what, I'm going to read this book. And so you opened it, and I bet you at least got through the first verse before you thought, I don't understand what I'm reading. Because that's a pretty self-explanatory verse, isn't it? You may not agree with it, you may, but it's a pretty easy verse to understand. And the implications of it, though, are not just simple, they are profound in the way that we see the world and the way that we live in the world. And I would encourage you, if you have a pen or pencil or a bleeding finger or something, to circle a few words with me here that I think are relevant to, don't do that, kids, don't poke your fingers. But I want you to look at 3 words that I think in this verse that are just important, and we're going to look at some of them next week, some today. But the first one is the word in the beginning. One of the big questions that we wrestle with in life is, how did we get here? Where did we come from? There is all this stuff that is complex and vast, and how in the world did it get here? And the Bible would point us in the direction of a beginning that God created and that God started, and we're going to look more at that next week, so just kind of table that one. But that word beginning is important, that there is a beginning to everything that we see and everything that we are and everything we experience. The second word is the word God. It's probably the most important, because we are not here just randomly, we are not here by accident, but there is someone behind everything that we see and experience, and God is the creator of all things, that all things begin with Him. The word that's used for God in this text in verse 1 is used 32 more times in the book of Genesis to talk about how God is the one who makes us, that God is the one who was there in the beginning. And the point is made that God existed before all things. He is the one that was there. He is the eternal thing, the one that was there. And everything else was as a result of His influence. And so God was there. And finally, the word created is the third word that I would have you to circle. The word created. The Bible uses the word create in the context of God being the one who creates, and it doesn't ever, I don't believe, use the context that man or women created. Now, we make things, but God is the one who creates. Now, you've seen this in life. You and I can take different pieces and parts, right? If I was to give you a bucket of Legos, you could take the things that exist and make something. Some of you could make really cool things with that, but you still have to start off with some Legos to begin with. And the Bible doesn't talk about God taking things that previously existed. That He takes the world that was nothing and He shapes it into something. And so this idea that God, being our creator, influences the way that we see the world in which you and I live. That God took nothing and made something. And so you and I look at a God that's introduced to us in verse 1 of the Bible, where God creates the universe, He creates the earth, He creates everything that exists. And the Bible presents this fact as something that we should assume. Now, we live in a world that doesn't assume that, and I understand that, and we'll get to that in a moment. But it's my hope over these next few weeks as we walk through this first chapter of Genesis that you will see that the world in which you live is a beautiful and glorious and intricate place that reflects, when you look at all the detail, all the incredible things that are in this world, that you will be, as Michael said earlier, that you will be amazed by the glory of God that is displayed before us in what He has made. Several years ago, there was an article that was entitled 7 Reasons Why I Believe in God. And he began to just talk about the way that the universe is, the way that the earth is, and how it's, you would almost think if it was an accident, it's an incredibly detailed accident, that the world is just perfectly set up for people like you and me to exist and to live upon. He said, consider the rotation of the earth, that our globe spins on its axis on a rate of 1,000 miles an hour. And if it were just 100 miles an hour, our days and nights would be 10 times as long. And because of that, vegetation would freeze and the days would be too hot and too long. Consider the heat of the sun. It is perfectly set, and we are the perfect distance from the sun so that we don't burn up. And in fact, we benefit from the heat and the radiation and everything that comes our way. Consider the 23-degree slant of the earth, and its tilt is just right, that if it was a little bit off either way, we wouldn't be able to live. The oceans would freeze or other things would happen to us. Consider the moon. It is the perfect distance. If it was too close, it would create enormous waves that would destroy all lands. Consider the crust of the earth just a little bit thicker, and there could be no life because there would be no oxygen. Consider the thinness of the atmosphere that is perfect, that if our atmosphere was just a little thinner, that the millions of meteors that now burn themselves up, and we look up at the sky and say, oh my, look at the first star I see tonight, or make my wish, or one of those little things that are falling stars or whatever, those would destroy the earth because they would pummel the earth because they wouldn't burn up. And on he went, but finally he said this: the fact that man is capable of grasping the idea of the existence of God is in itself sufficient evidence. What I mean by that is that we are intellectually enough, smart enough beings to be able to look at things and say, you know what? Everything in life, if it's massively designed and beautifully, intricately designed, someone made that. You don't find accidental beauty, right? You don't. My son is working on a little project, and he has to get a little shoebox, and we're going to make a little fake world inside of it. And I jokingly said after looking at this sermon this week that we're just going to take a bunch of stuff and throw it in the box and shake it all up and just hope something nice comes out of it. He didn't want to do that because he got an F, but that's not the way it works, right? When you see design, you assume a designer. And when you see intricate detail, you assume someone is a designer behind all of that. And so you and I, he was amazed by that we are able to process that. It was our intelligence, our awareness is a sign that there's something behind us, beyond us, that has made us. So you find those last four words there, the heavens and the earth. The Hebrew didn't really have a language or a word for universe, and so that's the Bible's way of saying that everything that you see, everything that you walk upon, everything that you are, the heavens and the earth, God was the designer and the maker of them. And so you look at that phrase. That phrase speaks not only to where we come from, but it also challenges how we think. And it's not just a challenge, but it's a battleground in a lot of ways in the world in which you and I live. For example, this challenges the idea of atheism, the idea that there is no God, that we are just accidental, just some massive accident. And this verse challenges that because Genesis assumes the existence of God. It sets forth a personal God, not just a distant God, but a personal God as well as a universe that was created by Him. It challenges the idea of being an agnostic, which in the spectrum of belief, if there's a firm believer in the God of the Bible, and on the other side of that spectrum is I don't believe anything's there, there's a lot of people who just kind of waffle in the middle saying, I don't know about that, I don't know about that, I'm just going to waffle in the middle because we just don't know. They're agnostic, they don't know. And yet this verse challenges that. It challenges us to realize that there is a God who does reveal Himself, who shows Himself for who He is. It refutes the idea of pantheism, or the idea that God is in everything. Watch some of those Disney cartoons. You get some of those things where God is in nature, and so we worship nature, and we treat nature as if it's a God. But this verse talks about that God is above creation. God is above nature. Genesis, it challenged the idea of polytheism, which if you look back in history, that the Old Testament came out of a time when most nations had multiple gods that they would worship, and yet the Bible presents this one God. The Christian faith came out of the Roman and Greek cultures where they had their whole Roman and Greek gods that they worshipped, and yet there's just this one God. It challenges that made all things. It repudiates materialism. There's a distinction between God and just matter and the things that have been made. It challenges naturalism, that we can know nature, and yet nature has an origin. It has someone who rules over it. It challenges our humanism. And so all these isms and all these things that are the battleground of our mind and we wrestle with in our minds. Now, I share all that because this quote from A.W. Tozer, I think, is a helpful one and showing us why this matters, okay? A.W. Tozer once wrote this in his book, The Knowledge of the Holy. He would say this, that what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. And why would he say that? Because he would go on to define that when he said, we tend by a secret law of the soul to move toward our mental image of God. Think about that whatever your mental image of God is where your life is going. That if you don't think there is a God, that your life is going to move in the direction and live with the ramifications that there is no God, no matter how much you fight that or what. If that's your belief or mental image of God, then that's where your life's going to go. If you believe in the God of the Bible, your life is going to gravitate in that direction. If you don't know if there's a God, again, all those other different views of God, your mental image of who God is where your soul is going to move in that direction. And so you look at that and you think we live in a world where for so many people, the idea of these first few chapters of the Bible, that God, there is a God, or that God made the world, or that there was a flood, or that all those things that we're going to read about in these early chapters, that you think, well, that's just beyond belief for me. And a lot of people have moved on in their belief, and that's where we kind of find ourselves here today. That number one, that you live in a culture that has moved beyond belief in the story of Scripture. That's where you live with a lot of people that you know and interact with, and maybe even as a believer, you find yourself struggling with some of those things. There's been a growing shift in our culture away from faith, and that can happen for a lot of different reasons. One, maybe it's just the doubts and the skepticism that kind of drives us in our hearts. This past summer, we looked at a Sunday school material that explored a lot of the reasons that people have doubts, and they're legitimate things, real hard things that we wrestle with. Maybe it's the evil and the pain and the struggle of the world, and you look at all the broken things around the world and you think, well, where's God in all of that? Or maybe the Bible's teaching of the doctrine of hell and judgment, or the violence you read about in the Old Testament, or the seeming tension between science and Scripture, or the exclusive claim of Jesus to be the way to God, or the hypocrisy of Christians in the church, and that the church says we should be this, but yet we live so differently. And that drives people to think, well, I don't want to believe in God if these things exist. And so maybe some of it is that, some of it is driven by that. As a culture, specifically as Americans, following 9/11, there's been a strong push towards getting rid of anything religious. There was a host of books that came out following 9/11 that not only decried the religions of Islam and others that maybe were responsible for those attacks, but they just looked at the history of the world and said, you know what? Religion throughout history has been a major source of pain, of wars, of struggles. And so if we just got rid of religion altogether, the world would be a better place. And so a lot of that thinking has begun to really take a firm grip in people's minds. And so instead of examining the goods and the bads, the benefits or maybe the struggles of certain religions, people have just kind of thrown the baby out with the bathwater and thought, you know what, let's just get rid of all of them. And so I grew up in a world in which religion and faith in God were looked at as solutions to much of what was wrong with the world. And yet many people today, they don't look at it as a solution. They look at religion and faith as the problem. That's what's wrong with the world, is all these people with these religions and these faiths, and they do all these things in the name of their religion that just make the world a terrible, terrible place. I don't agree with that, but that's where many people are at. And so we live in a world, in a culture that for many, they've moved on beyond belief in the stories of Scripture. David Platt is a pastor and church leader, and he wrote a book called Counterculture that I've been living Not living in, reading. How about that? That's what I've been doing with the book. I've been reading his book, and in the first chapter, he introduces that with a couple of quotes that I think summarize this idea that not just that I don't like it, I'm not going to deal with religion, but there's this attack against it. And he says this, that the Supreme Court of the United States has called Christians who believe what the Bible teaches about marriage bigots and enemies of the human race. Similarly, in a recent court ruling on religious liberty, a state Supreme Court declared that Christians should be compelled by law to compromise the very religious beliefs that inspire their lives. And he goes on to say this, these legal statements merely reflect the anti-Christian sentiments that the media, business, entertainment industries are aggressively promoting in the minds and hearts of American individuals, families, and institutions every single day. Now, you read those, and if you've lived in America for a while, you know that's an uncomfortable statement. Those are hard things. But I take comfort in this, that the Hebrew faith and the Christian faith both grew out of contexts where there was no moral Christian majority, there was no moral Hebrew majority. They grew up in places where they were always the alternative. They were always countercultural to what most people believed. And so they grew and they thrived and did well as those who held to their faith, sometimes against insurmountable and difficult and painful odds. It grew in that. But you and I live in a world, for a lot of us, we grew up, it was a very comfortable place to be a Christian. And now it's not so much anymore. And we kind of have to stop and evaluate to think, okay, how am I going to do? What am I going to do with my faith in a world now that oftentimes rejects or pushes back against my belief in that? And so this whole series, I hope, will not only reinforce and remind us of why we can believe those things. But maybe if you're on the fence or you maybe have doubts and questions, I hope that it will kind of be encouragement to you. I watched this session, a video several months ago. We went through with some of our high school kids that we're meeting with some of our kids earlier in the spring from Andy Stanley. And he gave this quote that I've appreciated that I think is important and helpful as we kind of think about why does this matter? Here's why this matters. If you're a person who feels like you're pulling back from your faith, here's why this matters. That you can't move away from something without moving toward something else. Now, some people think, you know what, I'm just going to pull back from faith and stand in the middle. But you can't do that, because if you're pulling away from something, you are always pulling towards or moving towards something else. And so you think, well, I'm just not going to be quite as fanatical, but you're embracing something else when you do that. And he gave an example of just using atheism as an example of that atheism isn't just a moment where you stop believing in God. Atheism is a complex belief system that logically leads to conclusions that are worth noting. And he goes on to give some tenets of atheism that he calls them. And these are some of the implications that when I move away from, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, this is where the natural conclusions of that go. And people who are the leading thinkers of that recognize that and teach that and embrace that. Number one of the tenets is this, is the illusion of mind. In other words, am I a soul? What am I as a human being? Am I a soul? Am I a unique mind? Am I a unique individual? Or am I simply just a bunch of biology, chemistry, and physics at work? Atheism says all you are is biology, chemistry, and physics. You are not, there's no uniqueness to you. There is no self. All of that stuff is just chemicals, biology, physics at work in your body. So there's no more sense of uniqueness in mind. Number two, the illusion of free will. That we have a choice in where we go with our life. That if there is no God, all we are is just a random, predetermined order of biology, chemistry, and physics colliding with each other, and there really is no free will. Number three is the one that I think is most relevant to a lot of what we deal with every day, the illusion of value. Why does a person have value? Why do I care about a poor person who lives in a slum in Guatemala? Why do I care about that person? If there is no God, I don't have a reason to care for that person, because that person's life is not valuable. They are just consuming resources that the rest of us could use, and so we don't need them. But why does a life matter? Why is there value over a life? And we're going to look at all kinds of different lives. Maybe it's the unborn, maybe it's the elderly, or those that are just kind of falling behind in some things in life. Why does life have value? Well, if you believe that God created the heavens and the earth, it means that that person has value outside of themselves. But if you don't believe in that, one of the tenets of that is that there is no value. And that's fine in a lot of ways until we want justice out of life. And all of us deal with, well, that's not fair. But if there is no value, there's no fairness. It's just a matter of survival of the fittest. And so we'll unpack that more in the future. But number 4, you believe that something came from no thing or nothing. You believe something that is massive, that is intricate, that is packed with detail to the smallest part of you. You believe that that came from nothing, that somehow that just happened to be here. Number 5, that the first life emerged with no life, or from no life with no help, That the first life emerged from no life with no help. And number 6, natural selection that is responsible for life after first life. And so you see that when you pull away from in the beginning God created, you may say, well, I'm just going to step back a little bit. But really, it's the idea that if we're stepping back from that, there are things I am stepping to. And I may not want to acknowledge those, and I may not be out parading for those kinds of things, but natural consequences is that I am moving in that direction, away from something to something. All right? And so you can't move away from something without moving toward something. And so, where does that leave us here today? Maybe depressed and sad. I don't want you to do that. I want you to leave with this thought, okay? What kind of faith is needed then in a world that has moved beyond belief in a lot of ways? Well, I think the kind of faith that will last is the kind of faith that moves beyond belief. Number 2 here. And I'm not being redundant by this. What I'm saying is that we need to move to a faith that moves beyond just head knowledge. And a lot of us can get away with, I went to Sunday school, learned a nice, cute little Bible story about some guys and gals on a boat, and yet it has nothing to do with my life. But the kind of faith that lasts believes that there is those stories, that these stories we're going to look at. We must have a faith that I live, that impacts my decisions and my thinking and how I treat people and my regards for others and myself. It is a faith that I live, not just a faith I believe in certain mental agreements. You see, the time for you to just go along with the culture around you and expecting any kind of validation or encouragement, they are long gone. Almost every voice around you is discouraging your belief and your faith. And so over the next few weeks, it is my hope and my goal as we journey through these texts that we are going to hopefully fill your mind with stories, remind you of these beautiful and awesome stories. But if all we do is, oh yeah, I remember that story, then we have failed. I want them to begin to make connections between the stories and the ethical, the moral, the social, all of the decisions that we wrestle with every day. Each one of these stories is going to speak into our wrestling hearts and the ideas that we wrestle with as cultures, the value and the identity of a human being. What is a human being? That is a question that the Bible speaks into. Issues of sexuality, of marriage, of human trafficking and slavery that still exist today more than ever. Why do those things matter to us? Poverty and race relationships, our struggle for justice or fairness. Why do those things even matter? I think the Bible presents good, solid reasons why those things matter. And what our culture likes to do is they like to get rid of the Christian teaching, but they like to keep the values that Christian teaching brought. And it's an uncomfortable tension. But as a Christian, as a person who's looking at these things, the connection is clear. The reason that there is value of life, or the reason that we care about people who are being trafficked or sold as slaves, or we care about people that are living in poverty, we care about people that are not receiving justice. It goes back to these early stories, and the stories just continue through Scripture of God's heart for these key things. And so, I hope over the next 3 weeks, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 weeks here, as long as we're in this, to do 3 things. Number 1, I want to give you reasons to believe. I want to reinforce your faith. I hope that we will be able to do that in some ways. Number 2, I hope to see the far-reaching truth of God's Word, that you realize it's not just a nice little thing I spend an hour for so I feel a little bit better about myself, and I leave it behind as I go out into my real life. I hope that you see that God's truth has everything to do with your real life and your real world. And number 3, to cause you to react to that truth of God in your life. That you will not be a person who just knows Bible facts, but you will be a person who says, you know what, as I look at another human being, I see value there because I know those stories and I know who God is and I know that God has made each one of us with intrinsic worth, not because anybody says so, but because God says so, and that person's life matters. And I hope to reinforce some of those things in your life. All right? I want to finish with this passage from James chapter 1. James challenges us to look into a mirror in this text, and I want us to do that the next few weeks. He says this in verse 22, "Be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves." And he goes on to say, "For if anyone is a hearer of the word only and not a doer," if we're not going just beyond simple head knowledge to the simple faith, "he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror." And what we're going to see as we look at us as human beings in the mirror of God's word, the mirror of the issues of the world, so we're going to find these issues that we see. And so what are we going to do about them? He looks at himself and he goes away and he forgets what he was like as the person who just puts a few facts in his head and just walks away and leaves it behind. But he finishes up, "But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, the one that Jesus brought, the love your neighbor as yourself and love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, that law that sets us free, and who perseveres in doing so, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he himself will be blessed in his doing." So I want you to learn to be blessed by taking these good old truths of God and doing them and acting upon them and making a difference in your world through them and see God begin to come alive in you and through you. And so, as you wrestle with the world that oftentimes has moved beyond belief in a lot of these stories, I hope that you will be a person who is going beyond belief in the way that you live them and embrace them and live out the truths that they